Dr. Abela. Thanks for joining us on the Culture Eats Everything podcast today. So great to see you again, sir.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So you're the dean of a business school. You've got over 100 employees, and you just released this fascinating new book called Superhabits, the Universal System for a Successful Life. And super excited to jump into the details of that book, but also talk about your own leadership journey and challenges along the way. So we can share that with the audience. But you had said maybe we could start with how values, how virtues, how super habits that you've talked about shape culture and vice versa. So talk a little bit about that from your experience.
Sure. So I came up with the word super habits, which is the name of the book, as another word for virtues, because people usually conflate virtues and values, but values are the things that you think are valuable. Virtues are then the habits that make those values come alive. So very, very different. You could have certain values and act against them consistently, but very few people act against their habits, because habits kind of just make us do, in a sense, what we do. So by calling the virtues, and the other problem with the word virtues is a lot of people think of it strictly in terms of like, be virtuous, be good, and they don't recognize that the important part of a virtue is that it is a good habit. And that habit kind of really powerful, really important. There's a research study that just came out about a month ago showing that of all the different approaches to behavior change, habit comes out on top. So it's not surprising we're seeing so many books about habits this and habits that, because it really does work if you want to change people's behaviors, if you cultivate a habit. So virtue is a good habit, a super habit. It's because it's kind of like a superpower. That's where I got the name from. Sort of superpower habit. If somebody is disorganized and they cultivate the habit, the virtue, the super habit of orderliness, they become more organized. People are too used to kind of labeling themselves, so-and-so is kind of messy, or this one is not very courageous, this one's not very creative. Those are all things that can be changed by cultivating the appropriate habits. And we all have the potential for all of these, And so when I think about an organizational culture, in a sense, that culture is the function of all the virtues or the super habits that the employees have, in the same way that one's character is a function of the virtues, the super habits that you have. So in a sense, the culture of an organization is kind of like the character of an organization, And so I think that looking at super habits, looking at virtues as the components of that is a really important perspective to have.
Well, and I love the distinction you made between virtues and values. One of the Enron's values was integrity. And I always share that with clients to say, it doesn't matter what's on the wall. It doesn't matter how much time you spend fine tuning your mission statement. If you're not living it, if you're not on a mission, if you're not living the values in that case, it actually can backfire on you, can actually create more damage than if you just left the wall blank. I love that idea that and that culture arises out of people's virtues. We're very much in line with that, because we often say that it's kind of like Seth Godin's definition of culture. It's the way we do things around here. It's not even what we say. It's not what we write on the wall. It's literally how are we behaving as a collective group that matters. And that's what a culture really is. It's why you can almost smell it and taste it when you walk into an organization. So, and I also love that you said that it's not helpful to label people as messy or disorganized, which is so valuable and yet so often missed in our society, especially for really smart adults. We all think that we're a way. And so maybe we can start with exploring that a little bit. How do you help people to adopt more of a growth mindset there? How do you get people to think differently about they're not stuck the way they are?
I think a first step is to make them realize that whether you have a fixed mindset or you have a growth mindset, it's true, right? Because if you believe that your abilities are fixed, they will be fixed, because you won't try to improve them. Whereas if you believe that your abilities can grow, you will try and you will find that you will grow. The neuroscience is really, really helpful here. The idea of neuroplasticity, the idea that you can create new pathways in your brain by practicing something new. And you can do that. Now, our brains are very, very neuroplastic as children. That's why children learn languages so much easier than adults, for example. but that neuroplasticity never ends till we die. So it doesn't matter how old you are, you can always be creating new habits and therefore new ways of living. And you do that, the best way to do that is to pick a simple thing that you can do repeatedly. So if you want to grow, for example, in the virtue of, pick the example of orderliness, somebody's completely disorganized, never gets stuff done. If they pick the simplest possible practice, okay, each morning I'm going to write down one thing that is important for me to accomplish today. End of the day, I'm going to check it if I did it, Simple thing like that. Before you know it, that person is using a to-do list, and then after that, they're using some kind of organized system, to keep track. But the key thing is to pick one new thing that's going to advance you in that habit, that super habit, that is challenging enough that it is actually going to move you forward, but simple enough that you're not going to avoid it. Because if you avoid it, then you go nowhere, So just pick the simplest thing and do that repeatedly. And what happens is the first time you do it, it's hard. The second time, it's less hard. And each time you do it, you make it less hard for the next time. And you've began a sort of pathway to growth. I like to use the phrase, beginning is winning. As you try to develop a virtue or a super habit, merely beginning, you already start to experience the happiness and even the health benefits from many of these, surprising ways. We can talk about that. All you need to do is just get started, get the flywheel going, by taking it the littlest little step in the right direction.
And I've heard conflicting ideas out there about how long it takes to truly embed a habit into your life. And so I don't know if you can shed any light on that as far as what the brain science says. I've heard that, for simple habits, it takes less time, and for harder habits, it takes longer, which makes sense. But is there any science around how long it actually does take and what the discipline is there?
What you just said is about the only true thing you can say, because the answer, there are many different studies and their numbers are all over the place. But the answer is it depends on what you're trying to develop and who's trying to develop it. Every person is different. They start at a different place. But the good news is the range is small. It's not, in a sense that it's not like it's going to take you 5 years, to become a more orderly person. You can see effects sometimes just in mere days. You start practicing something for a few days, you already start to, because every time you do it, you're kind of carving that neural pathway. You're making it easier the next time around. More complicated habits can take you a few months, but we're talking a few months, not a few years. But again, and beginning is winning. So just you're benefiting every point along the way. It's not really a matter of when do you end, because the journey for growing in the different virtues is a lifelong journey. So you're never finished in a sense, but you reach the point where the thing is easy, and that's the real payoff. Because I think when another problem with people think about virtues is somehow that the idea of no pain, no gain. That may be true in the beginning, but once you become truly, you master a particular virtue, once you become truly virtuous, say in courage or orderliness or humility or whatever, it actually gets easier. And people have difficulty believing that. But you think about it. If you wanted to learn how to play basketball and you started shooting, at the hoops, and it's hard for you to get a basket the first few times, but then the more you practice, it then actually gets easy. And it's the same thing with any of the super habits.
Yeah, the key is to have the discipline to keep going. We stole an idea from Jerry Seinfeld. Have you ever heard of the story about Seinfeld and how he created a habit of writing content and writing how
No, tell me. I haven't heard this one.
So he someone asked him once, how do you create so much material? How do you do that, Jerry? And he said, well, a few years ago, I realized that I just needed to sit down and write content for, I think it was 20 minutes a day. And I had a little calendar and I would cross out every day that I did it. And after a few weeks, I realized I had this beautiful chain going on the calendar. And I said, just don't break the chain.
Yeah.
And that was, here we are decades later and he's still doing that. He says, whether it's good content or bad content, doesn't matter. Just the discipline of sitting down and writing for 20 minutes a day is the key to this. And that it was really helpful for me because it helped me to bring more disciplined approach to to lots of things, including exercise and reading more, all those things into my life. Just that simple thought of never break the chain.
Yeah, it's there's a line from I forget his name, but an ancient Roman philosopher. The line was "Nulle die sine linea," never a day without a line. So if you're trying to write something, at least one line every day. And you know that once you sit down and you write a line, a sentence, you'll probably write 2 or 3, and you'll probably do a page or 2. And that's in effect how I write all my books. I have a day job as a dean, so early in the morning, start writing a little bit a day, and bang, off you go.
The secret for my business partner and I was to hire a ghostwriter. That's what got us there.
As an academic, I cannot do that. That would be that would be
I don't have that. I don't have that problem or limitation. So you got some amazing super habits in the book, from restraint to humility to diligence to gentle firmness, which I thought was a really cool one, to forgiveness, orderliness, you already mentioned, all the way through to courage, self-discipline, practical wisdom. So obviously we're not going to have time to get into all these today. Maybe we'll have you back on and deep dive into some of them later. But I want to start with courage, because there's this idea that courage comes from the same root as the word coeur, which is a French word for heart, and that just as the heart pumps blood through our veins and keeps us alive, so is courage the heart of all virtues. That without courage, no other virtue is possible. We can't live up to, we can't demonstrate and be able to live into our other virtues. So I'm just curious what you think of that, and then maybe we can jump into how you think about courage.
Sure. So I think it was C.S. Lewis who had a line where he says, "Courage is the form of all the virtues at their testing point." So I wouldn't say that without courage you can't have any virtue, but without courage, the virtues aren't going to go very far. So what I do in the book, so that we know the 4 cardinal virtues, right? The prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. So prudence, the habit, the super habit of making wise decisions. Justice, the habit of treating others fairly and respecting their dignity. Fortitude or courage is the habit of not basically of moving forward despite your fears. Yeah. So it's not being afraid. That's not within our control. Fear just comes, like any emotion. But courage is the habit of continuing to move forward no matter what. And then self-discipline or temperance, the habit of only following your desires when it makes sense. So we typically hear them in that order, but the developmental path, I think, is to reverse that order. You start with actually self-discipline or temperance, because without any self-discipline, you get nothing at all done, right? You just follow whatever you feel like doing. But the very next one, to your point, is courage, because then you may have the self-discipline, but if you don't have courage, every time you hit an obstacle, bam, you're knocked flat on your back,
I love it. I love it. So keep going. Talk a little bit more about courage and how you explain it in the book, and how you would specifically in the case of leadership, because that's who is our primary listener out there, is how should leaders be thinking about a different way, maybe, of thinking about courage in their day-to-day jobs.
So in the book, I tell a bunch of stories about these different virtues, and what I'm doing is I'm drawing kind of the ancient teachings of Aristotle and the other philosophers, the Stoic philosophers, and I combine them with the research from positive psychology, put them together, so the old and the new together. But the organizing framework that I use comes from Thomas Aquinas, medieval philosopher. And the huge insight that I got from Aquinas was that you don't want to try to develop one of those 4 cardinal virtues directly, because those are really big efforts. So to grow in courage directly is really hard. So if somebody says, I want to grow in courage, like, where would you even begin? Likewise with self-discipline, if you're not disciplined, where would you even begin? It's kind of like a catch-22. Like, how do I get going? And what Aquinas does is he shows how each of those 4 cardinal virtues has a number of other kind of what they call allied virtues that are sort of smaller but contribute to the main one. So, and courage is a good one to start with because there are 4 of them. Self-discipline has 15, so it's a little more complicated, but courage has 4. And what Aquinas says is, recognize that, so if courage is only is kind of moving forward regardless of fear or anxiety or any other kind of negative feelings. He says there's two kinds of challenges that you might face that would cause fear. There are challenges that you can sort of attack and overcome, and then there are other challenges in life that you just have to endure, right? So maybe a chronic illness, for example, or maybe your business is going through a bad patch and it's there's a recession on. It's like, okay, I'm going to keep struggling, but I don't see any end in sight. So if you will, there's already two types of courage there: one for winning, one for enduring. And for the winning, he said, this Aquinas is so practical. He says there's two virtues there. One is for solving a big problem through your human effort, and another is for solving a big problem by spending lots of money. It's very practical, right? And the one for human effort is the virtue of magnanimity, right? Comes from the Latin mania anima, big soul, right? That's kind of having the habit of kind of relishing a big challenge, having the zest to say, okay, and this is the super habit that most entrepreneurs have, most leaders have, right? It's like, I got the vision, let's go after this, everyone. Let's take that wall, let's take that hill. And so that's magnanimity, really important for leadership. The one way you're going to spend lots of money is the virtue of munificence. And this is, in a sense, the courage to make big investments for a good cause. It's typically big investments with your own money. Spending other people's money doesn't take too much courage, but it's also the virtue of philanthropists who give large sums of their own money to try to achieve something great, like big donations and so on. So those are the two virtues allied to courage for dealing with a challenge that can be overcome. So magnanimity, munificence. For challenges that cannot be overcome, that have to be endured, at least for now, Aquinas divides into physical and psychological, or physical and mental. Physical is the virtue of perseverance. That's you undergoing some kind of physical suffering. You're usually tiredness, but it could be sickness, and you keep on going. That's true perseverance. And then for mental, it's resilience. You're depressed, or you're unhappy, you're anxious, or whatever, but you keep on going. And really interesting, Aquinas is writing this 750 years ago. Today, the most popular and successful treatment for depression and for anxiety is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is nothing other than cultivating the habit of resilience. That's really what that is, So 750 years ago, he was already getting this right. So those are the four. So if you wanted to grow in courage, you would figure out which of these four would be most useful to me right now. What tends to get in the way of doing what I need to do, what I want to do? Maybe it's I just struggle with anxiety. All right, your first step is to work on growing in resilience. And that will contribute to growing in courage.
I love it. So you can't go directly at it. You gotta come at it through the side door.
Yeah. And that contributes right away, because each of those is more tractable than trying to just I'm just going to grow in courage. That's just too big of a lift,
Yeah, we get a lot of that with especially our younger leaders that we work with, where they want to grow in their confidence. And we'll say, well, you can't really go at confidence directly. You have to see what you're afraid of and then go do it anyway. And
exactly.
You do it and you don't realize that you don't die and you survived, then you'll be able to do it the next time a little bit easier. And then you grow in confidence.
You are actually there guiding them on growing in typically perseverance or resilience, right? So they're afraid of taking on this big challenge. They might hit flat on their face. That's resilience, right? So by doing it anyway is the best therapy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's go to humility next, because that's one of my personal favorites, and just talk a little bit about sort of how do you think about humility?
So let's talk about both restraint and humility, because interestingly enough, they're sort of twin virtues in opposite ends. So they are both allied to self-discipline or temperance is the word. But so many words about virtue have different meanings now. So instead of temperance, I rather say self-discipline, because that's what temperance used to mean. And now we just think of it in terms of alcohol, So self-discipline, if you want to grow in self-discipline, just like courage, you want to pick one of the smaller virtues. And both restraint and humility are virtues related to a part of self-discipline. They are both ways of disciplining our desires to do stuff. Restraint is our desires to do petty stuff, and humility is for our desires to do great stuff. So petty things would be like, make a rude sign at somebody who cuts you off on the highway, for example. Or you're on Amazon and you see something and you think, oh, I'm going to buy that, just the instant, right? The kind of temptations we get all the time. Restraint is the habit of going, nah, I'm not going to do that. I feel like doing that, but I'm not going to do it because I see how stupid it would be, Or even just, I'm going to put that on my wish list, or I'm going to put it in the cart, but I'm not going to click buy until tomorrow, so that's restraint. So humility is the same thing, but the opposite. It's for desires to do great things. So desires that be very worthy. I want to build a great company. I want to solve world poverty. I want to, just like all these great aspirations that we might have. Humility is the habit of having a right understanding of our abilities. So it's not kind of debasing ourselves and saying, oh, I'm hopeless, because that would actually be an error opposite, like from one direction against humility, right? It's sort of there isn't a proper word for it. We just refer to it as false humility. Yeah, and we see that in people. It's like, oh no, me, no, false humility. The opposite end is the vice there is presumption, which is kind of like, oh yeah, I can do great things. This is important because it's not saying that you shouldn't stretch yourself. It's good to stretch ourselves, to have stretch goals, but even the stretch goals have to be realistic. Because if they're not realistic, then you're going to fall flat on your face. You're going to waste time and money and just sort of do harm to whatever cause you're trying to achieve. So true humility says, okay, have a right understanding of what you're capable of and what you're capable of if stretched. And then let that guide what you say about yourself and what things you choose to do.
I love that. A right understanding of your abilities. It's with the stretch. So it's not even limited, but it's like it's within the realm of possibility plus a little bit.
Well, I mean, the possibility should still be within the realm of the possibility, right? But you don't often know that, so you have to try. But you're being rational about it, yeah. And then to grow in humility, there's actually quite a bit of research on this. So this is nice. We can give recommendations that have been studied and proven to work. So one that I really like is to use a third-person perspective. So let's say I think I want to take on a particular project and I'm excited about it and I want to do it. And I also want to do it because I think people will clap if I do it, and so that's sort of attracting me. That's what can sometimes cause us to violate humility, is the vanity that comes from thinking about, hey, if I succeeded here. The technique is to take a third-person perspective and say, okay, if I were an outside observer watching me, what would I say? What would I say about this situation? And then if you sit down and be honest with that, sometimes you'll say, well, I would say that I probably don't have nearly the resources to get this done. So maybe it would be stupid. Maybe I should just redefine my scope, So that's one useful technique. Another one that I really like is you want to embark on, say, a certain course of action. Write down everything you don't yet know about this course of action. Really helps you grow in clarity and humility. Right? It's like, okay, well, I don't know how quite we're going to get there. I don't know anybody in that business. I don't know, you start listing and you realize, okay, maybe that was not such a good idea,
It's interesting. You're describing my journey of the last couple of years of becoming a keynote speaker. And earlier this year, I was talking to my wife, and I'm a pretty even-keeled guy. And I said, babe, I don't know what's going on, but I'm feeling anxious, like nervous about this speech that I have to give. And she cut me off like right there. And she said, you have to give it. And like that, she got me to realize that, no, of course I don't have to give it. I get to. What a privilege, what an honor. I get to serve this amazing audience of a few hundred leaders who are working mostly in the elder services business, something that's very near and dear to me with my parents. And she shifted my thinking from me to what are people going to think of me, right? To being of service to the audience. And almost immediately, my anxiety started to dissipate. Now, the second part of that was I realized I also wasn't ready. I wasn't really sure what I was going to talk about. And so I had to sit down and, like you said, write down what was my game plan. And between
Yeah.
those two things, I was still nervous, but in a good way, but I was excited, right? I was excited for it. I was excited for the challenge of it. And the challenge is to continue to foster that, to continue to be conscious of it, first of all. So
Yep.
as you think about humility for leaders, right? If CEOs, superintendents of schools, a lot of them have imposter syndrome. In fact, we like to joke that 90% of the leaders we've met in those positions, fully admit to having imposter syndrome, and the other 10% are liars. So what's your advice there for folks who are wrestling with that and their own humility?
There's a number of different ways you could come at it, but by going through these sort of humility exercises, it works both ways. It listening what you don't know, and then you get to listening what you do know. You realize it stops you from being overconfident, but it also makes you realize, no, I have something. When you started to plan your talk, you probably realized I have something to say here. I have something that could be very helpful to them. So shifting your focus onto them instead of onto yourself. The imposter syndrome can be somewhat narcissistic, right? Because it is, oh, I don't feel like I'm, it's like, doesn't matter what you feel, just like do the job, it's like you've been put in this job, maybe you sought it, now do the best you can. And I mean, there's another important virtue, right, which is honesty. And so being honest about your own concerns. As a leader, we feel like we can never share any uncertainty, right? Because everybody's depending on us. And sure, you don't want to go around telling everybody, oh, I have no idea if we're going to make it. I have no idea if we're going to make it. That doesn't help. But especially to those who are close around you, you can be direct with them and just say, I realize we're taking some risks here, and we have some uncertainties here. What are we going to do to minimize the uncertainties, to minimize the risks, and so on? But Brené Brown talks about vulnerability, which I think is, to my mind, is sort of a compound super habit. It's partly honesty, it's partly courage, right? It takes a lot of courage, but it's particularly humility as well. So it's a whole bunch of those things put together. Which is why I prefer to disaggregate it into its sort of component parts. But that, I think, is important. So all three of those virtues, those habits, are important for a leader. So somebody who's suffering from imposter syndrome, hard to do all three at once, but think about which one of those would I benefit from right now? And if I can make a little pitch, there's a companion app to my book. So my book's called Superhabits. There's also the Superhabits app. It's really easy to find because the website is superhabits.app. And it's not a downloadable app. It's just web only. So it's very easy. You go on it and you just do a free survey. In fact, the whole thing is free. Do a survey, and it tells you kind of how you rate on each of the super habits. And you then look at those results and say, okay, which of the ones where I'm weak are the most important? And so if you're a leader, you're suffering from imposter syndrome, and you find that humility you score really low, that's a good place to start practicing.
We'll make sure to put a link to that in our show notes here, along with a link to your book. So that's great. And I want to go back to what you said about imposter syndrome being a little narcissistic in a second. But at first, I want to talk about the idea that vulnerability is a compound virtue. I love that idea of a compound virtue. You just put your finger on something we've wrestled with, because she's made it very popular. And we've told folks that vulnerability is not really the goal, in our opinion, because no one wakes up in the morning saying, like, oh boy, I can't wait to be vulnerable today, right? They can wake up, though, and be willing to say, okay, today I need to be more honest, or I need to be more, muster more courage, or I need to be more humble. And those, I like to just say being open and being real. Like that's something people can go to work on, and it doesn't feel so like overwhelming, which is what vulnerability feels like, I think, for many people.
Yeah, the nice thing about the virtues is that you can't have too much. There's no such thing as too much courage. there's no such thing as too much humility. The difference is the too much and too little comes in the thing that the virtue is dealing with. So if humility is assessment of your abilities, you have too high of an assessment or too low of an assessment. Those are the mistakes, right? The mean of having the right assessment. You can't have too accurate of an assessment of yourself, because the more accurate, the better, right? So where you can't say that with vulnerability. You could be too vulnerable. It's like, just shut up, right? So yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. And especially if you're trying to mix them all together, it can feel overwhelming. It's like putting way too much seasoning on a steak. It just gets gross after a while.
Right. Yeah.
So the narcissism, talk a little bit more about that.
So the first two virtues, I was saying, growing in self-discipline and growing in courage being the kind of the pathway forward. Both of them relate to feelings. And again, this is following Aquinas. What's really interesting is oftentimes we think that the way to deal with our feelings is either like the sort of modern mind says we just want to just follow your feelings, right? Follow your emotions, follow your feelings. That's the way to kind of live authentically, The other extreme is that somehow feelings are bad and you need to use your willpower to like stuff it down, So if you want, so diligence is a great example. So diligence is self-discipline related to the desire to know things. And some people would say, well, just follow your curiosity, follow the muse, just whatever you want to know about, just follow that. Others would say, no, discipline, like I'm blanking out. Diligence, bear down, study what you need to study, and giving into your feelings. It's not stuffing your feelings. It's cultivating, guiding your feelings in the right direction. So if you need to study something, try to fall in love with that thing, And so the narcissism, I think, arises when you're just following the feelings, following the desires that sort of you think you want, right? That the desires want. When in fact, that's not a path to happiness, right? That's a path, in a certain sense, to a certain kind of slavery to those feelings, and it's to yourself. So most people can't see that. Like, how can you be a slave by yourself? But your feelings are like fire, a terrible master, but a good servant, And so you don't want to let the fire burn uncontrolled, but you also don't want to quench it, because our feelings, our emotions are what give motion to our lives, right? Our desires are what lead us to want to get out of bed and do things. So you don't want to stomp on your desires, but you want to gently guide them. Okay, with this, I desire this thing, but that's probably not good for me. So let me just slowly start trying this other thing, and then the desires will follow,
Yeah, it kind of circles back to that idea of a right understanding of your abilities, which reminds me of I heard this idea that the word humility actually comes from an old Hebrew word, anava, which means to take up your God-given space in the world, which is interesting because if you think about that, like it's let's say a basketball, most of us who feel like we're really humble will only take up the size of a baseball, and we feel like we're being humble. But what Anava is saying, that no, don't do that. You've been given many gifts. You've been given many capabilities. So go live into that full basketball space. Now, don't grow into a beach ball, because that's your ego and that's going to be about you, right?
Yeah.
And so you gotta sort of check yourself there, and again, to your point, right understanding of your abilities. So to me, that was super helpful, because I see so many people sort of at opposite ends of that spectrum.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's a good one. That's a good analogy. Yeah.
So you mentioned before that, and I wish we had more time. In fact, I think probably one of the things we'll invite you to do, if you're interested, is we've got a couple of groups going for CEOs and superintendents that we convene once a month called the Interchange. And then we're launching a group for leaders who are not at the top position called the Exchange. And it would be really fun to just kind of jump into some of these things with a lot more activity, a lot more interaction. So we can talk about that later, but we're kind of running out of time. And I want to touch on a few things. One, you mentioned the health benefits of this. And then I'd love to just kind of wrap up with part of the subtitle of your book, which is a universal system for a successful life. And I'd love to hear, how do you think about what a successful life is?
Sure. So the health benefits are really astonishing. So something like restraint, you would think, yeah, I can see how that would be healthy because you don't eat as much as you would, otherwise, and you don't take stupid risks and so on. So I can see how that'd be better for your health. But research shows, even, for example, growing in the super habit, the virtue of gratitude, by keeping a gratitude journal every night, writing down things you are grateful. They've done experiments, controlled experiments, where they find that people who do this relative to people who don't will not only see decreases in anxiety and depression, for example, but also decreases in chronic physical pain. It's amazing, and can't explain it, but that's what the research says. And it's the same across all the different virtues. That the more you practice that habit, that super habit, the healthier you get. Which is really cool, isn't it? So yeah, it's partly what inspired me to write the book, as I was reading study after study across all these different super habits, and there are 40, actually a total of 50 that I touch on in the book. The same story kept coming up again. The more you practice these, you get happier, you get healthier, life gets easier, you get more effective. It's like, of course, they're superpowers. Everybody should do this, and the only cost is start practicing. So to the subtitle, The Universal System for a Successful Life, I actually put "the" in because I want to make the very bold claim that these aren't just sort of like random set of habits that you could take or not take. This is the set of habits that if you want to live your best life, if you want to flourish, if you want to take up that space, these are the ones you need. They're not, and not any others. We're not missing any, and we're not, we don't have any surplus ones. This is truly the set. And by successful life, I mean that in the broadest sense. So really, truly kind of human flourishing, making the most of your talents, and contributing the most, and being the happiest you could be. And there's no incompatibility among those, So you just, you're given a life, you're given a set of talents. As you grow in each of these super habits, these virtues, you're just able to contribute more, you're able to enjoy life more. And even in the worst possible circumstances, and sometimes people, through no fault of their own, end up in really bad circumstances, right? Deaths of loved ones or wars going on around them, all kinds. The best way forward is always to grow in virtue. Regardless of the set of circumstances, you will always be happier, more effective, having a better life by growing in virtue. Doesn't matter what's going around you. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Reminds me of, was it Viktor Frankl's sort of man's search for meaning, right? That here he is enduring the most atrocious thing you can think of, but in many ways he's doing a lot of what you're talking about.
Yep, exactly.
Well, great. So for listeners out there, pick up Superhabits and check out I'm assuming a good place to start is superhabits.app, because people can get a quick baseline for where they are and then go to work on creating a more successful life for them. Any other resources you want to point to before we wrap up here?
Yeah, I also have a Substack, a free Substack, and that's superhabitsingular.substack.com. So it's what we used to call a blog. Right now we call it a Substack. And I'd write roughly weekly there. There's a lot of material there about the different super habits and the science behind them and so on. So that's a good source as well. I'm also on LinkedIn. They search for Andrew Abela, Abela. I try to post almost every day on LinkedIn with something smaller about super habits. So.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you for your time, and more importantly, thank you for all the young minds you're shaping out there to go out there and put all this good virtue into the world.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.